Okay, everybody, so I'm going to go ahead and get things started. My name is Jenna Nilo. I am the Director of Marketing and Outreach with Illinois Digital Educators Alliance. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Especially I want to thank Ben and Taylor with Class Intercom, who are going to be taking us through Beyond the Algorithm today. So Ben and Taylor are actually the co-founders of Class Intercom, and they're going to tell you a little bit more about that shortly. But today we're going to be learning how social media algorithms work, how to use storytelling in order to beat the algorithm, and how to bring social media into your classroom. So they've got lots of good things to tell us. So little housekeeping items first is please keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. That way there will be no background noise. I'm sure my dog is going to go crazy soon, so I will be muting myself shortly. Also, if you do have any questions, Taylor will be monitoring the back channel, so use the Zoom group chat if you don't mind. Put those questions in there, and as they come up, Ben and Taylor will go ahead and answer those throughout the presentation. We are recording this presentation today, so tomorrow I will be sending out a link to everyone who registered today for the recording. You can also find all of our webinar recordings on our website, so you can always look there under the Learn tab. There's a Wednesday webinars, and all of our recordings go there. So either this one or any of the other ones you might have missed or missed in the future, feel free to look there at any time. I will also be including the link to the presentation today. So Taylor and Ben have agreed to give you guys the presentation link. So we'll be sending that out as well. At the very end of today's presentation, I will be putting in the chat window the link for PDHs. So if you are hanging out for the full hour and want to get professional development credit for that full hour, then please make sure you hang on till the end, and I will be putting that link in there. The link will be open until midnight tonight, so make sure you click it and register yourself, after which time we'll be closing so that you guys get credit for being here and all that good stuff. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Ben and Taylor, and then I'll pop back in at the end. I am going to, like I said, go ahead and mute myself, and if you have any questions, put those in the chat window. So thanks, Ben and Taylor, signing off to you.
Hey, thank you so much. Well, as we get started here, this is Ben Pankinen. I am co-founders with Taylor Siebert. Taylor's also with me in the same room.
Yes. Hey,
Welcome,
guys.
Taylor. So Taylor is going to interrupt me probably with something Nerf related to make sure he can stop my voice. If you've got a question, he'll try to interrupt me, but if I can come up for air, he'll try to keep that going. But I kind of want to frame things in this sense that, you know, actually, my background is not that of an educator. You know, my background, I built a company called Social Assurance, in which we help market to financial institutions across the country, built a software platform and really helped them get started. And my first introduction into education, we were working with a larger district, and you know, Taylor and I went into the meeting and I said, you know what? One of the challenges I've had is that a lot of times I hire students that had graduated through journalism, advertising, programs like that, you know, at the local university. And this was actually a group of students that I had had in one of my intern classes that all worked for me as interns at the same time. This was actually part of our intern dodgeball match that we were facing some other software companies. But what was really interesting is, and if I kind of went through them, it's kind of funny because Avi on the left was at Google for a long time, and we've got a couple others. Chris on the far right worked for Crocs, actually still works at Crocs, running their marketing, those goofy shoes that he's still trying to convince me to wear. And you know, Nikki actually runs all the marketing for Tough Shed if you're out at Home Depot. And then Lauren does marketing for an agency. And you know what was really interesting, and when all of them came to work for me, we had this one very specific challenge in that we would start to ask them to create social media content for a brand, not for themselves. And that always created this weird scenario where they would have this moment where they would say, well, but how do I create content that's not about me? And I think that's one of the things that we're going to talk about today, is that we're sort of accustomed to, and the most obvious thing that comes to us initially is when we're making social media content, is how do we make content about ourselves? And that's one of the things we started here at Class Intercom, and that's one of the things that we're going to talk about through this webinar, is understanding what it's like to present content that's not necessarily about you. It might be about the school, it might be about a brand, it might be about a wide variety of things, but that creates a different dynamic. So when I think of, what we do in really helping schools to manage, the software to manage their social media, that's a big challenge of what we struggle with. So as you saw in the webinar description, what we're going to talk a little bit about today is first, we're going to analyze a little bit about what makes posts go viral. What were the things that happened behind the scenes for, we'll use Facebook as one of the examples, but this applies directly to platforms like Twitter, Instagram, all of those. And when we sort of break those down, what is it that makes a post show up into our feed, and how does that work? We're going to talk a little bit about who gets to be responsible for social media for a lot of the schools that we see. We're going to talk a little bit about how we work with students in this role. How do we help students to be a part of that? And then we're going to really kind of dive in a little bit deeper on the narrative that we create when we make social media. What is it that makes that happen? So with that, we're going to talk a little bit about Facebook's algorithm and how that works. Now, not to freak everybody out. This isn't necessarily a math webinar, but we're going to talk a little bit about math, right? So one of the things that happens that you've probably noticed when you open up your Facebook page, you log into Facebook and you're looking to see the content that gets produced, is that you don't necessarily see the content from all of your friends. We also don't see the content from all of the pages that you've liked. Now, when Facebook first started out, that actually was different. When Facebook first started, if you were friends with someone and they made a piece of content, that showed up in your feed. But Facebook recognized, just like Instagram did and Twitter started to realize, that that was just far too much content. And the platform itself got to be too overwhelming for us to understand all of the content. And as we developed more and more friendships, it used to be that the average Facebook user had 150 friends. Now that's more than triple that. But we sort of have realized that there's just too much content. And so Facebook and Instagram and even Twitter to some degree, although much less so, have realized that we need to help people to see what's important to them and maybe not all of the messages. Now that gets a bad name at times. That's part of the reason why Zuckerberg's been testifying in front of Congress, things like that. But we're going to just talk a little bit about just the nature of why you see what you see when you log into one of these platforms. So when we look at Facebook's algorithm, it really comes down to 4 different elements: inventory, signals, predictions, and then ultimately a score of each individual post. And to dive into those a little bit, inventory is really based on when you log into Facebook. The inventory comes to all of the posts that could be available to be displayed to you at any given time. So what that means is it could be that if you've got 1,000 friends on Facebook, each of them make a post in a given time period, then that would have 1,000 posts, right? So the more friends you have, the more potential inventory you would have. Also, the more pages you like, the more potential inventory that could be displayed to you. Additionally, it could be ads as well. So it could be also when you log in, Facebook does a quick check and says, okay, Ben logged in. How many friends does he have? Here's all of his friends. Here's all of the content that is available. And it puts that into one big bucket. And then it also says, who are the advertisers that want to serve up content to Ben? And it adds that to the bucket of inventory that's available to be displayed to me. So once it looks at that inventory, then it looks at what are the signals about each individual post. So some of those could be who posted it. So, signals could be like, hey, Taylor posted it, right? It could be, what's the content about this post? So Facebook's looking at things like, I happen to be a dog person, so I have 2 dogs at home. So I actually tend to comment on dog posts. Facebook knows that. It's pretty clear to them. It's not rocket science. They know this image contains a dog. Then that's part of the signal that's available in there. They also look at what time is it, not just what time was that posted. Was it a recent post? But also what time am I logging in? They also look at really interesting things as how much time does Ben typically spend looking at content? Is he sort of like going to check for 5 minutes on Facebook, or does he typically check for 10, 15 minutes? That becomes relevant. Also, things like bandwidth. Oftentimes we don't think about that, but if I'm accessing from a mobile device and Facebook's displaying large-scale video, they know Facebook's incentivized to keep me on that platform satisfied with my experience as long as possible. That's what allows them to display the most advertising opportunities. It's what allows them to keep me involved. Now, that bandwidth becomes important. If I'm accessing from my mobile device and I'm on a cell network, they know I'm not able to pull down as much video. So they are checking things like that, even to figure out what's being available. Now, then what happens after we've determined the inventory, we've determined the sort of signals. What's the content about? Is it a photo? Is it a link post? We see that oftentimes if you're reading social media reach type of information, maybe photos display better or maybe links display better. That's definitely true. Things like native video on Facebook definitely do get more reach than if I put a link to a YouTube video. There's certainly advantages to either of those, but that's the type of thing that Facebook puts into those signals. Now, what I'm describing to is exactly the same on Instagram as well. Now, then what they're doing, the third area that they're taking a look at is now they're starting to make predictions. So based on the signals that Facebook, Instagram have looked at, now they're starting to look at those probabilities. So Ben clearly does like posts that contain dogs. Not so much cats. Sorry, just not a cat person. But they're looking at that type of content to say, oh, this is something that Ben would likely engage with. He's also then Facebook's looking at how likely is it that Ben would engage with that person's post. So you've probably experienced this where you have someone on Facebook or maybe even Instagram that you haven't engaged with any of their content for a while. And so maybe you've thought about it, or maybe you looked them up and you did a quick search for their name on Facebook and you said, oh yeah, they work over in that other school district. You clicked on it, and then all of a sudden you noticed the next day when you logged into Facebook, you saw some content from that person. What Facebook's starting to do is say, hey, maybe you're actually more interested in that person's content. That's part of the predictions that they're starting to make. Hey, maybe you would like to engage with their content more frequently. We just haven't displayed any to you in a while because you hadn't engaged with them. These become really important things to start to consider when we reach predictions, when we are a brand looking to engage with other people. Because what we start to find out is if I make content and only 10% of the people who like my page see any given post, then what I start to realize is I have to get engagements in order to get those displayed to them again. So what we find oftentimes, if you're working with high schoolers, my niece, for instance, and I look at her Instagram, she will make a post and she has a little bit more followers than I do, but she has much more dramatic engagement. So what happens is her friends are just far more likely to scroll through many, many posts, and they're also likely to like almost every post in their feed, because they're just going through and giving a heart to absolutely everything. So what's happened is she's getting that displayed to the 400 people that she typically gets a like from on Instagram. She's getting that displayed every time. So Instagram's starting to make that prediction that Lauren's posts are getting liked by all of these people. And so that's what continues to happen. Now, what also starts to factor in is, did anyone else comment on this page, right? So if I'm a high school student and I got 100 people to engage in a post on Instagram, my likelihood of other people who are friends with them seeing that post it goes dramatically higher. So what you'll see a lot of junior hires and high schoolers do is they might take that selfie, post it to Instagram, and if they don't get engagements within 15 minutes, they might remove that post. What they're doing is they've started to realize that Instagram's making a prediction on whether or not that post contains any virality to it. And so they're making the determination that this post won't go, so I'm not going to let it go. And so that's part of what they're doing in manipulating that algorithm, is realizing if I didn't get any traction quickly, then I'm probably not going to get more traction long term. So that's part of what those junior hires and high schoolers do.
Would you recommend a school to do that, Ben?
Absolutely not.
That's what I thought.
No. I think that's. I hope that was a question. Was that a question from one of our?
No, yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking, and maybe what some others were thinking.
Yeah, no, I don't necessarily recommend manipulating that, but what you have to start to realize is sometimes when I'm conveying information that's purely educational, and I'm not presenting information that is more inspirational, the people who want to be educated don't see that content. And so that's part of the reason why we really need to be aware of how these algorithms work is, I want my audience to see the messaging that I have. And so I need to understand a little bit of how these algorithms work. Now, what ultimately then happens is, based on those first three, is we start to get a score. So this happens to be a score from my friend Gavin on Facebook. And so, clearly I like content. I have liked content that contained animals. I'm not totally sure why they displayed this to me, other than there are a few things to note here. One is that, Gavin's been a friend of mine for a long time. I probably engage with most of his content. He doesn't post heavily, but I also have other friends who have also engaged with it. You'll notice that Chris, down at the bottom, it mentions right away that Chris and 137 others have liked this. So it's a heavily engaged post, and one of my mutual friends with Gavin also liked that post. So that starts to influence how I see it. So that score ultimately ranks on each time you log into a social media channel. The posts that get ranked up at the top are typically ones that have that high score. But then, those social media platforms want to keep us there for as long as possible. That's the only way they get to display more advertisements, is to keep us on that platform longer, which is also why they introduced what they call the infinite scroll, which means I continue scrolling down and it continues feeding me posts, and you are not likely to actually run to the end of your feed.
I would love to get a poll from our audience of who remembers back in the day when you did reach the end of your feed.
Yeah.
That's
a good question.
That was quite the time.
Yeah. No, there used to be a time where we had a lot less content on
Right.
social media platforms. And that was much more common to find sort of the end of the content. But yeah, you're probably not seeing the end of the road. You might on Instagram reach you're all caught up, but it will continue feeding you more content as you move through it. So that's just a little bit of the social media algorithms. I think that's something that that you can use in a classroom. You can start to talk to people. Again, when we're working with students, to think about how are they thinking critically about what's displayed to them. Those 4 areas are really critical to just understand, why is this being displayed to you? So they might know that, hey, if a bunch of my friends like an Instagram post, then it's more likely that others of my friends will start to like it. They know that, but they might not think about why that is. So this may give you a little bit of a background to why those social media channels are the way that they are. Now, another thing that oftentimes comes up is the point of view at which we display social media content. And I think this is something that we often miss. And when I look at the content that a lot of schools are making, is oftentimes we have a singular point of view. Like oftentimes we have that one person who's managing social media and they're trying to represent as many different viewpoints as they can. But it's just really difficult to sit in all of those seats. You know, when I sit in my nephew's classroom and they've got a guest speaker, or I, go sit with a band and volunteer, like that is a different experience. It's a different point of view. And so when we think about who's responsible for social media, we have to think a lot about the point of view that's coming out of social media. And what you're seeing with a lot of commercial brands is they're starting to say, hey, we've got different viewpoints that oftentimes we miss. So as a brand, we have a reputation, whether we're a large sports brand or whether we're a band or we're whatever that brand is that's trying to convey a message. A lot of them have started to realize that on social media, I need to display and create different points of views. And we're seeing a lot of schools who start to do this as well. And we're seeing them say, hey, how do we invite students to be a part of this? How do we bring them into these platforms so that they can begin to create some of that social media content? Taylor and I have talked about this a number of times, but what we've had the experience with, and part of the reason we started a company in this space, is that Taylor invited me to speak at a conference to 100 or so high school students. And in the front row, there were 4 students who were all sophomore girls who were creating social media content for their school. And I asked them how they were doing that, and one of them turned her MacBook Air off to the side. They had matching MacBook Airs from the school, and she said, well, my teacher actually just this morning gave me the username and password for the school's social media accounts, and so all of us are really been delegated to make some social media content for the school. To which I looked at and said, hey, how do we help that? I love the fact that they've probably picked the right students for this process, but how do we help that to happen without sharing passwords? How do we help that? And so we have a software that we introduced to schools, and that's partly why we're hosting these webinars, that our software helps to sort of delegate that type of access. So we think it's really important that we get students involved in that process, but without having to share that password. Because realistically, we want the social media for the school to not necessarily be just for adults anymore. And I give you this, a lot of times when we start into our content, that involves, digital citizenship, a lot of times we sort of throw students into this idea that we have all of these different social media platforms. And actually, my nephew, who I took to the basketball game last night, just a couple years ago, I handed him, my wife takes photography as part of her job. And so I was showing him, he's just really engaged in new content and technology, and he's just very curious, just a fun kid to work with. And so I handed him our about $3,000 professional photography equipment. So I hand him over this camera, and at the time he was about 10 years old, and you're kind of handing it to him, and he grabs it and he turns it around and takes this photo. And I thought, what a crazy experience. Anyone else, who's my age, that you hand a camera to, wouldn't even think to take a professional grade camera and figure out how to spin it around and take a selfie. I still don't know, with his hands being the size they were, how he was able to take that one-handed and have it in focus. I'm still trying to figure out how he did that. But I think it's a really interesting perspective because when we invite students, we start to see content that we would never think of. So part of that is, just getting them involved, getting them to figure out what's the role that they can play in social media. So one of those roles is that, like Drew, of becoming a content creator. How do you see social media, and what do you think we could message as a school, as a brand? Some of that is bringing students in and starting to develop social media content in a classroom and saying, hey, how do we get you involved in creating some content that maybe you can suggest to us, right? That you can get us to start to create. Another way that we found that is one of the easiest ways to get students engaged is to take our school calendar. So if we take just our normal school calendar, we've typically, printed it or emailed it to parents. If we take that monthly calendar and we say, how do we make this something that exists in social media channels, and start to get students to think more creatively about it, it gives them the chance to schedule out content. So maybe they're not necessarily creating just that content today, but they're saying, oh, we've got a content calendar. By the way, this is exactly what brands do with agencies. So advertising agencies across the country who do social media content for brands, they could be working with a large consumer brand like Oreo or Nabisco or something like that. When they're creating content for them, they'll take a calendar and they'll mark out the days. What do we want to post on these days? Well, this is exactly what, we've actually created the calendar already as a school. We know when the events are happening. Now we get to sort of back into that and teach students how to create content about something other than themselves.
And one of the things, Ben, I just wanted you to touch on too, we talk about when you're working with students and having them create content, this is no different than any other class. You've got to provide some structure. You've got to create a box for them to create in. This using the calendar is a great way to do that and engage them. We just had a great story from a school up in Wisconsin over the last couple of weeks, and the power of student-generated social and putting together an anti-vaping campaign. And the advisor, the teacher saying, hey, which of you wants to put this together? And then letting them create within that kind of that box, and some really neat things happened.
That's a great comment. And one of the things that I love doing when we're doing kind of student exercises is helping them to unlock creativity by cutting down the variables, right? So when we give them a box to play in, we start to have creativity really come alive. So whether it's, giving them an assignment like a calendar, or we take things away. When we tell them, hey, just make social media content, all of a sudden we get something that's pretty crazy. But, when we start to restrict things and say, could you in X number of words, or could you come up with an image that helps promote anti-vaping, right? Like that starts to restrict the variables, and we start to see a creativity unlocked. All of you have experienced that, I'm sure, in a lot of different areas. But just know that the agencies that I've worked with, this is how they do it. And so what's really fun is, we get to see some schools that actually operate like an advertising agency. And, what we find over and over again, and for those of you who listen to our podcast called The Content Generation, what we talk about is that everyday jobs are doing this. When we look at the changing workforce of our world, you might not have social media as your full-time job after graduating from high school, but we do know that is highly likely that it's going to be part of your job, is developing content. And that's what we see a high value. We also think it's a great way to teach civics, right? Digital citizenship and traditional civics really aren't all that different in that, we want to teach some of the academic principles. You're likely doing that through some sort of digital citizenship curriculum today. We also have some ways that, we want to figure out how is that tactical, and how do we demonstrate leadership in those areas, well, typically that's by getting them involved in creating some of that content. And so, we've also worked with a number of schools who have started developing social media internships, where they take a group of students and designate them as participating in an internship for the school in developing content, or even simply gathering content. Now, in a lot of businesses, we would call those community managers. Those are people who are looking throughout the organization to find content that could be posted to social media. Now, this is actually a great use if you're connecting with journalism, you're connecting with digital citizenship, you're connecting even with, we have several sports marketing firms that are, within a few blocks of our office here, and we see them doing that consistently, where they're gathering sports related content and sharing that out, and they're doing it at college and pro levels. This is something that really could give some students a leg up who have that type of an interest. So, no longer are the student managers, just preparing the sort of equipment and things like that for practice. A lot of them, at a college level, are now creating, Instagram stories or things like that, and that's a great way to get students involved as well. I was working with a group of students, and one of the things that they started to do, I was I think I'm in that picture, kind of surrounded a little bit, but
you blend in.
Yeah, when
you
I was
look like a student.
yeah. Just had a milestone birthday, not feeling like it anymore. But one of the things that was great, this was actually down at Oklahoma City. Their teacher actually asked me to go on a tour of the school with these students. And what was really fun in that experience is walking with a group of students and saying, what would you highlight about your school? What makes your school unique? What do you love? And it was really fun to walk with a group of students that had a diverse activity level within the school, where a couple of them said, oh, you need to meet our shop teacher. Our shop teacher is just the coolest. And I said, hey, that's awesome. If he's available, let's stop in. We stopped in, and he said, oh yeah, what are you doing? I said, well, we're looking for things that we could post onto social media. Well, they had never thought that they could create content from the shop. But I literally talked to their teacher and said, hey, could you make some sparks fly for us? Like this will be great social media content. But it's really fun to see it's not just restricted to a subject.
And I want to follow up. That school now has an actual social media class. So when you went down there, it was just kind of a club, and now it's an actual class. They're doing student and staff spotlights every week, highlighting those staff members. So it's really cool to see that come full circle.
Yeah. So there's a lot of ways to get students involved, and some of it's just kind of eye-opening and asking them to think about the things that they're interested, the parts of the school that make it unique. And that really has the foundations in great communication that can serve them really well in a professional career down the road. Now, one of the other things that we want to talk about is, as we're developing and inviting students, is understanding how is it that we understand how the narrative plays a role in creating great social media content. Paul Zock is a really interesting writer. He writes relatively frequently for Harvard Business, but he has a book that he calls The Trust Molecule, in which he tests actually how much trust you're building as you're doing different messaging or different things. Phenomenal writer, but more interesting in his role as a chemist, in understanding that the way that we do different things create spikes in oxytocin and actually cause people to be drawn into your story. And so what he finds is that, when we listen to someone who has drawn out a character-driven story, we see an increase in trust in the same way as introducing someone who's familiar to them. So what it starts to do is actually boost trust. And in this exercise, he actually was asking them whether or not they would donate money. And he did some really interesting exercises that determined when you could relate to a story, and then you're far more likely to be involved. And really, as a school, that's part of what we want. We want them to be drawn into a story enough that they want to be engaged in it. Maybe they want to come to an event. Maybe they want to participate as community members. But the more we start to draw out a story, the better results we start to get. So we'll talk just a little bit about storytelling. But I think this is a really interesting exercise that we don't often do when we talk about telling a story of your school. When we start to take a story, that we've taught, from grade school how to write a good story, and then we start to, change those roles just a little bit. So when I work with marketers in telling a brand story, what we talk about are things like associations, the conflict, and a call to action. Ultimately, what a lot of times we're talking about is not just what happens, but what is about to happen. Now, when we talk about what's about to happen, what we have is actually, something more like this cover of Life magazine. If you're ever in my office, I have this cover on Life magazine, because what it actually shows is it says, "We're going to the moon." Right. So when we say we're leaving for the moon, oftentimes, when we look back in history, we only read the story of, hey, we landed on the moon.
After.
Yeah. But what's interesting is that this story had been evolving for a long time. And if you ever want to listen to the most interesting speech that JFK probably ever gave, it was the 10-year period before we went to the moon. His speech about what happens and why we're going to go to the moon. Absolutely inspiring speech he gave. But that story, oftentimes we miss when we're making social media. A lot of times we say the score of Friday night's game was this, rather than saying, here's what it looks like to prepare. And great brands and great social media content starts to tell us about what's going to happen and what we're in the process of seeing. And I've got a couple examples here. One of these was from a school in Nashville area, and I saw this piece of content, and I said, this is something that we don't always show, but this shows you. We sort of know what's going to happen. We see the passion in these students in what they're going to do. And I think that's a really exciting process to start to say, hey, what are they going to do? That starts to bring me into their story more. I start to get some of the passion and emotion from these students. So I'm no longer reading history as far as what their score was, but I'm now seeing the engagement of what they're going to do, and it draws me into that story. So I think those are really important. They also did a post that I caught that was telling your community about what's happening in the school. So this was their Hump Day post. Obviously, someone is dressed up as though they are riding a camel on a Wednesday, and I can almost hear the Geico ad in the background talking about Hump Day. But what's really fun about that is oftentimes we don't get that story of what's happening in the school itself. And so I think the more we can kind of draw that out and develop those, it gives students a great opportunity to share those, but gives us the chance to see what's happening.
Well, and notice the caption. They're asking their audience to help caption that, which drives engagement, gets more people to see it. And so I just wanted to point that out, how they did that, and you can look at the reach they got, the number of engagements. It was successful.
Yeah, so you can definitely get great results when you're telling good stories, and it's not just schools that do this, right? So these are brands that start to do this. If you fly Southwest, which I do maybe more frequently than I would like to, but when I fly on Southwest. There's really one disadvantage of flying on Southwest. And, I get to ask this sometimes at a conference or, a seminar. And every time I ask it, I say, what's the one challenge we face with flying on Southwest? I get the same response every time, which is you have to pick your own seat, right? And sometimes you get a seat that you're not expecting. But what was really interesting is, Southwest ran this campaign just a couple years ago with this young Instagram influencer named Brandon. And Brandon started out this campaign for them. And they called up Brandon and said, Brandon, would you help us? What we really need help with is we need help telling stories on Southwest. And they said, so Brandon, what we're going to do is we're going to give you a flight on any Southwest flight you want to take for an entire year. We see that you blog a lot about travel and, people's stories. So you get to fly anywhere you want. And he said, okay, what's the catch? Right? Like, what do I have to do for this? And they said, well, the one catch is you have to sit in the middle seat on every flight. And I think, what they ended up doing, right, is he started to sit in the middle seat, and he started to uncover stories like this one with Kim, where he says this was Kim's third flight ever. She was smiling when I sat down and said hello, right? You start to uncover that, in each of these scenarios, he started to uncover stories like David, where he says, hey, he just kind of lights up that room or a plane, right? He starts to figure out that David has a really interesting spot. And I think what we've been able to see when we've worked with students is to say, hey, the same can be true in your school. So Southwest ran this entire process as a campaign. And they ran it under a campaign that was called Every Seat Has a Story. Behind every seat is a story. And I think, any school should be able to say that every student has a story. And when we start to employ the students around them to gather those stories, we start to see some really interesting stories happen. We were working with a school this last year that really took this kind of to the next level. And one of the ways that they did it is they had 4 seniors who were really bought into creating social media content for their school. And these 4 seniors, I fortunately got the chance to meet them. I actually met them at an education conference in which their teacher asked them to do the presentation for her. So it was all educators at this conference, and these 4 seniors, 4 high school seniors, who shared about how they made the social media content for their school. I honestly was getting emotional in the room watching them do this, because not only did they say, hey, here's what we created, but as seniors, when second semester rolled around, their teacher challenged them and said, now the problem is you all 4 are graduating this year. How is this going to continue? And so these students started to make tutorials for underclassmen, helping them to understand that this has to continue. Like, we want the Blue Jays was their mascot. We want the Blue Jays to always have a great social media process. And so they started creating tutorials to help the underclassmen understand how they could make better social media content. And one of the highlight stories they shared was that they had a classmate that the teacher wasn't aware of had worn a Royals piece of gear. So Kansas City Royals piece of gear. Sorry for those of you who are White Sox and Cubs fans. Had worn a Royals piece of either a t-shirt or a sweatshirt or whatever every day to school for multiple years.
6 years.
Oh, 6 years.
Yeah.
Okay. So for 6 years, this young boy had worn something that was Kansas City Royals related. And so they ran a story with him, and they ran a story and posted it onto their Blue Jays school account. And of course they tagged the Kansas City Royals. The post gets, at least initially it had 30,000 plus in reach. Kansas City Royals starts sharing it. And this boy who had never been to a Kansas City Royals game got a trip and some stellar tickets to get to go to a Kansas City Royals game.
Full circle here, and I didn't even tell you this before the webinar, met the next group of social media interns at that school on Friday, and they were presenting doing the same thing, and they are doing an incredible job, and met JJ, the student you're talking about.
Oh, that's awesome.
And you could just, his smile lit up the entire room talking and sharing that exact story. And he even said it went viral for a little bit, and it's made his small world that, that he's living in, and changed his life, and being able to go to the games and get free tickets for his entire family, all because of, I want to add too, it was part of a Who Knew Wednesday campaign that they do every week. And so we talk a lot about consistency with schools and highlighting students. When you pair that together, some really neat things happen. And so it's a phenomenal story.
Yeah, I love that. I love JJ's story. We've gotten to see a lot of those, and it's those who knews kind of moments where we get to uncover something that as educators we wouldn't have known otherwise. Like, we don't get to see those options. We don't get to know the students as their peers know them a lot of times. And I think, again, when we roll back to, a lot of times our perception is that young people take social media and use it to generate selfies. When we see them telling the students stories, we see them telling the students, telling the stories of their peers, telling stories of someone other than themselves, it turns social media from being a selfie-generated platform to something that is selfless. And I think it's a really beautiful transition we get to see a lot of times. And a lot of it comes from helping them understand, how do we tell these stories? And some of that might be selfishly motivated from a school perspective, to say, we want other people to know the story of our school. We want our community to see that kind of story. And we'd love to celebrate and see more of these stories. So certainly, if you have some of these stories, I would love to hear about them. Feel free to tweet us. If you've got some stories, we'd love to see stories of student generated content. We'd love to stay in contact on some of the upcoming things. We've got some announcements here that we want to make sure that we plug for IDEA. But if you've got something that you want to connect with us on, we have a little page here at classintercom.com/IDEA stories. This is a great chance to either connect with us on some further content. Also, let us know if you're sharing something awesome like that. We'd love to be able to celebrate that with you. Additionally, we've done a social media trends and education report that we've got a link on that page too. So if you want to gather any content, we've done a lot of surveys with different educators all across the country. So this is a great chance to just dial in and understand and download some content for your school. If you want to understand a little bit more about what's happening in social media and education, as far as I know, this is really the only social media trends and education report that I've seen. So we've got that. We just started publishing that this week. So feel free to go on and check that out. I think it's just a great resource to understand what other schools are doing. Additionally, we've got some other webinars that we're doing with IDEA. December 4th, we're going to talk a little bit more about design and social media. What are the sort of visual elements that are important in our social media? Early January, we're going to be talking about 5 steps to building a student social media team. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about those stories there as well.
Yeah, we'll go a little bit deeper. We kind of, tip of the iceberg here for today, talking about some students and what they're doing. We'll go much deeper, give you some tactics and ways you can actually build that team at your school. And then on February 5th, Ben, we're going to be talking about podcasting with Amber, one of our content directors here at Class Intercom. And we do a podcast and practice what we preach.
Yeah, feel free to check that one out. It's called The Content Generation. Like I said before, we try to highlight people in different professional fields and how they're creating content for their job. Everyone from someone who's a composer. That was one of my favorites, is sort of listening to a composer understand how his job has changed. He's no longer just creating sheet music in one area, but he's creating and having to distribute it as well. To sports marketers, Kelly's running marketing at a company called Huddle. Many of you might use it for a lot of your school. So it has some great content in there. To people who are taking photographs for a living, Aaron is a fantastic photographer, starts talking about what he thinks about when he's on the sidelines of a football event. You know, Aaron used to do the Yankees program, and now gets to develop some of that content. And I think it's a really interesting way to start to capture all of the different possibilities for a lot of students. So additionally, I know we've got some announcements as well from Idea Directly, so I'll turn it back over.
Hey, thanks so much, guys. So just wanted to, before we say our final notes, I just wanted to let you guys know about our next 2 webinars. Next Wednesday, we have a webinar with the News Literacy Project on teaching digital verification to spark news literacy learning. So that is one of their very popular webinars, and they'll be doing it for us and for our IDEA members for free next week. So please go on and register for that webinar. And then the following week on November 20th, slide please. There we go. We've got one with Spiro EDU. So we're going to be learning about their new Computer Science Foundations curriculum, got STEAM, and they're going to be telling us about that and how to integrate computer science into your curriculum. So again, register for that one, and we would love to see you there. So last but not least, I want to thank both Ben and Taylor for a phenomenal webinar today. I saw the picture on Twitter of you guys ready for the for the webinar today, and dude, you have some fancy equipment in there. So no wonder you guys sound like you've got like the velvety voices over there. So I love it.
Well, I don't know about that. It's kind of my computer nerd nasal voice, actually.
Well, hey, it sounds good. Better than mine. So, so thank you very much, both of you, for your insight. I took some great notes myself, so I'm sure everybody got some great information on that. Thank you. And so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and put that link for the PDH in the chat window right now. So again, if you go to that link, hit it before midnight tonight, and you will get your 1 PDH credit. And if you have any questions, we're going to hang out for another few minutes just to answer any last minute questions. Go ahead and put them in the chat if you do. Otherwise, again, thanks so much, Ben and Taylor, and we will see you guys in about a month with the next one. So they've got some, as they showed you, they've got some great content coming up, and we're really excited about this partnership with them. So thank you very much.